My 2-year-old son Carter has always been what the doctors called a normal toddler. Like any other kid his age, he sometimes had tantrums or splattered his food all over the wall. Occasionally, he caught a fever from eating God knows what, or refused to go to sleep until after midnight. What comforted my wife, Annabelle, and I was the knowledge that all of that was normal. By and large, our son was healthy, happy, and growing more every day, until he woke up screaming 4 nights ago. At first, I thought it had to do with the move. We had recently transitioned from a cramped apartment in the city to a 2-story house in the suburbs. The whole neighborhood had been built in the 1950s, and it showed. Every one of the homes was eerily similar to each of the others, and all of them needed repairs. Still, the bones of the structure were solid. So what if there were a few leaks in the basement? So what if the lights didn't work in the upstairs hallway? The important thing was that our little family finally had a place that we could call our own. Or so I thought. The truth was, Annabelle and I were both expecting that Carter would have trouble adjusting to our new home. We had read books about children whose personalities changed or even suffered trauma as a result of being suddenly uprooted from a familiar environment. But Carter was thrilled by the change. He zoomed through the house, yelling excitedly into every closet and cupboard. To us, the worn old house felt small, but for our son, it must have seemed like the biggest playground ever. He slept 12 hours that night, and Annabelle and I finally got some time alone. Carter was just as enchanted by the house on the second day. While Annabelle and I unpacked, he built forts with cardboard boxes or climbed around inside the kitchen cabinets. We let Carter pick his bedroom, and he chose the smaller room on the left. When I asked him why, he just grinned. "Funny doors," Carter laughed, then ran away without any further explanation. I was left scratching my head. My son's room had only one door, the one that led to the hallway and to the bedroom I would be sharing with Annabelle. Why had Carter said doors? I figured that it was just toddler logic, and forgot all about it. My wife traveled a lot for work, but she had taken a week off to help with the move. Since he showed every sign of being well adjusted, she left for her first business trip last Monday. And that's where the trouble started. It had been a perfectly ordinary night: beef stew for dinner, bath time, pajamas, story time, and sleep. While Carter dozed, I wrapped up in the cozy plaid bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day, and read an old Raymond Chandler novel until I felt sleepy enough to turn out the light. A piercing shriek woke me. Carter. The digital alarm clock beside my bed read 1:44 a.m. I stumbled out of bed and down the lightless hallway to my son's room. I found him standing in his crib, pointing at the wall and screaming. This wasn't teething pain, hunger, or a stomachache. This was pure, unfiltered terror. "What's the matter, buddy?" I asked as I picked him up. "Does something hurt? Did you have a nightmare?" "Da run," Carter mumbled over and over. "Bama, da run." My son can usually speak complete words without a problem, but he was too agitated that night. It took 10 minutes of rocking just to stop the screaming, and even then, I still couldn't make out what he was trying to say through his tears. I offered water, a snack, and even told him that he could stay with me in the big bed if he wanted, but Carter just shook his head. There didn't seem to be any option except to lay him back in his crib. My son grabbed his favorite stuffed animal, a fat purple gecko, and rolled over, staring at the wall like his life depended on it. After a few minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing regulated, and I could finally get back to sleep. Although Annabelle wasn't around to witness the weird event, I mentioned it during our video call the next evening. Her advice was simple: give it one more night. If something else happened, I could move Carter's crib into our bedroom or set up the baby cam that we had quit using several months before. That second night was the first time that Carter had ever seemed nervous about going to bed. Even while I was giving him his bath, he kept craning his neck to look behind me, as though he were afraid some monster was going to come creeping in from the hallway. Even after I shut the bathroom door, his tiny fingers kept a white-knuckle grip on the edge of the tub, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. "Just holler if you need anything, okay, buddy?" I reminded him before ruffling his hair and turning out the light. "Sleep tight." When I got back to my bedroom, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. Carter was just a black lump in the crib on the far wall. He looked so small and fragile, clinging to his purple gecko plushie like his life depended on it. I wanted to stay by his side, but I knew that I couldn't be there every night, and that some battles he would have to learn to fight alone. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, too restless to sleep. I was waiting, I realized, for my son to scream. After 1:45 a.m. passed without a sound from Carter's room, I finally relaxed. Maybe it had just been a nightmare after all. At some point I must have dozed off, because when my eyes opened, it was to the sound of my son's piercing cry. Just like before, I ran to Carter, but what I saw in the hallway stopped me in my tracks. It was me, standing in the dimly lit doorway of my son's room. This version of me had wild hair, bloodshot eyes, and an enraged expression on its face. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting forward. My other self moved too, and only then did I realize that I was looking at a mirror. There was a full-length mirror on the back of Carter's bedroom door. I had never noticed it before, but then again we had moved in so recently. A cheap mirror on the back of a door would have been an easy thing for the old owners to forget, and since Annabelle and I rarely opened Carter's door all the way, we might have simply overlooked it. Maybe that had been the problem. My son was waking up in the middle of the night and getting scared by his own reflection. As much as I wanted to believe it, I couldn't help but wonder what had opened the door. Something else was bothering me too. Carter's stuffed purple gecko was gone. Sometimes he threw it out of the crib, where it usually bounced under the mattress or got lost in the laundry. But that night the plushie was nowhere to be found. "Bama," Carter was rambling again. "Durham." He wasn't making any more sense than he had the day before, but at least he calmed down faster. He reached out for his crib like he couldn't wait to get back inside of it and hide beneath the covers. Anything else I offered him only made that horrible wailing start up again. Although I didn't like the way he lay there, the sheet half covering his face like a murder victim in a mortuary. It seemed to be the only thing keeping him calm and relaxed. He was hiding, I realized with a shiver, hoping that whatever had scared him so badly wouldn't find him before the morning. The dark hallway connecting our rooms was also colder than I remembered. I put on the striped bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day and lay down on my bed to read. I wanted to get lost in those dusty yellowed pages, but I just couldn't focus. For one thing, my bookmark wasn't where I remembered leaving it. I had to go back almost 10 pages just to remember what was going on. For another, I would have sworn that my bathrobe had been plaid, not striped. No matter how many times I paced the bedroom or peeked out the door to make sure that Carter was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had burrowed down deep into my gut. During my video call with Annabelle the next day, I was almost afraid to mention the whole episode. She still had a full day left in her business trip, and I didn't want her to think that I was losing my grip on things back home. I asked about the mirror, but she said she couldn't remember seeing one in Carter's room. Later, when I mentioned the bathrobe, an odd expression crossed her face. The truth is, I couldn't decide. I had narrowed it down to those two patterns, but I was running late, so I just closed my eyes and picked one at random. It turned out to be stripes, but it could just as easily have been plaid. Annabelle hesitated. "Anyway, about Carter, why don't you just set up the baby monitor? That way you'll know for sure what's going on in there." We still hadn't fully unpacked, and it took me a while to locate the tiny camera that we had used to watch Carter when he was a newborn. I set it up on a chair facing his crib, and while I was at it, I also took down the mirror. I couldn't explain why, but the damn thing gave me a bad vibe, like it wasn't supposed to be there. Like it didn't really belong in our house. Just like the night before, Carter became unusually quiet after sunset. He kept his eyes glued to the clock, nervously counting down the minutes until nightfall. I tried to distract him with his favorite game, hide and seek, but he didn't want to leave my side. I could understand why. Without Annabelle around, the house felt too quiet. Our voices echoed strangely in the half-empty rooms, and I think we were both relieved when it was finally time for bed. Carter rolled over to look at the wall as soon as I laid him in his crib. I had the unsettling thought that he was just pretending to sleep, but I was too exhausted from the day to do anything about it. I skipped my nightly routine, instead taking a shot of bourbon to calm my nerves and sitting down in front of the computer monitor. From there, I could watch the night vision footage from the room at the end of the hall. At first, there was nothing to see but Carter tossing and turning in his sleep, his hands grasping unconsciously for his missing toy. I poured myself another shot. When I looked back at the screen, my son's eyes were wide open. In the dark, they looked like two black, empty pits. His jaw dropped in terror at the sight of something behind the camera. Something that I couldn't see. The camera fell to the floor with a crash. My son disappeared from view. I fumbled uselessly for a weapon, and finding none, ran down the hallway empty-handed. What I found on the other side of the tightly closed door was the last thing I expected. My son was sleeping peacefully, only the camera had been disturbed. It lay on its side, its wiry plastic guts scattered across the hardwood. Beside it was Carter's stuffed purple gecko. Was it possible that my son had found his stuffed animal, hurled it across the room to destroy our nanny cam, then fallen back asleep immediately? Maybe. It was even the most logical explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it. The more I tried to convince myself, the more certain I was that there was an intruder in my son's room. Almost unwillingly, I turned my head from side to side, searching. My eyes fixed on the wall beside me, the one Carter had been looking at in the video. There was a second doorway there. I blinked. To my right was the hallway I had come from. I could see the soft yellow light of my bedside lamp glowing beneath the door. To my left was another hallway, one that I was sure hadn't been there a few hours ago. It looked as lightless and empty as the void of space. Was that what my son had been trying to say? Dark room. If so, what did Bama mean? I was curious because now that I thought about it, Carter's words had sounded an awful lot like bad man. Dark room, bad man, I shuddered. Before I could decide what to do about the impossible doorway, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side. I glanced down at my son, sleeping soundly. Whatever was out there, the most important thing was protecting Carter. I scooped him up from his crib and rushed back to my own bedroom. While Carter squirmed and asked what was going on, I barred the door with a chair, pressed my eye to the keyhole and listened. A man-sized figure stood in the doorway of Carter's room. It hesitated for a moment, then charged. Between its speed and the darkness, I couldn't make out any of its features, but whatever it was strong. It shook the door handle so hard that I thought it would rip it clear out of the wood. When that didn't work, it started slamming its bulk furiously against the door. The first impact made the door rattle on its hinges. The second splintered the wood. I doubted the door would survive a third. I had already dialed the police. I left the phone on speaker mode while I grabbed Carter, covered his mouth with my hand, and crawled beneath the bed. It was a silly, obvious place to hide, but it was all I could think of to do. Shh, I begged my son. We hid in silence as 911. Once your emergency became remain on the line, and the nearest available officer will respond to your call. The lock held for a little while at least. A final blow sent the chair I had braced it with flying across the room. I could hear ragged, panting breaths in the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath heavy footsteps. I held Carter close and prepared for the worst. Sirens, my eyes snapped open. Flashing red and blue lights poured in through the windows. The intruder froze, muttered something in disbelief, then fled back down the hallway. From the first floor I heard urgent knocking. Shouts of police, and "Open up!" reverberated through the house. I hurried downstairs with Carter before they could kick in the door. The officers cleared the whole house, but there was no sign of any intruder or the strange doorway. I didn't mention Carter's dark room in the report I filed. I didn't want to risk being deemed mentally incompetent or a danger to my son. The officers were already suspicious of the bourbon on my breath. The only thing to support my story was my bedroom door, which hung from its splintered hinges like a drunk clinging to a lamppost, and of course, I could have done that myself. More than anything, I missed Annabelle. Fortunately, I would be picking her up from the airport in just a few hours. As the sun came up, I fed Carter his oatmeal and booked us a bland, boring hotel room for the next 2 days. There was no way in hell I was going to risk my son's life by spending another night in that house. I packed as quickly as I could, sure that I had forgotten at least half the things that my son needed for 2 days out of the house. I kept getting distracted. What if I glanced up from the suitcase and found that Carter or the closet door had disappeared? What if, when we tried to leave, the house didn't let us? I gripped Carter's wrist and kept my eyes straight ahead as we marched out of the house. If some awful grinning face was watching us from the upstairs window, I didn't want to know about it. After the engine started, I could breathe again. We were going to make it. It was raining when we picked Annabelle up from the airport, a grey, misty rain that made everything that had happened in the last few days feel somehow less real. My wife looked dubiously at the half-zipped suitcases stuffed into the back seat, then at Carter's confused, tear-streaked face. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she wasn't convinced by my story. It hurt, but I couldn't say I blamed her. After all, which was more likely? That stress from work, a move, and caring for a toddler had caused a mental breakdown, or that a portal to nowhere had opened up in a boring suburban home. The only question now was whether Annabelle would stay by my side in spite of her doubts, or try to get as far away from me as possible. When we entered the lobby of the hotel I'd booked, my heart was in my throat. If she asked the desk clerk to call Child Protective Services or alert the authorities, there would be nothing I could do. I would be locked away until my name was cleared, and Annabelle would be free to take Carter back to that house. I could sense her doubt as we walked up to the front desk, but all Annabelle did was smile and ask for the keys. My wife had chosen to stand by me. So what if the air smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning supplies? So what if the ice machine's rattle went right through the paper-thin walls? As far as I was concerned, the hotel room meant safety. It meant an end to sleepless nights spent running down that lightless hallway, unsure of what I might find on the far end. I could have cried for joy. I dumped the suitcases and threw myself onto one of the ugly beds. Carter climbed up too, giggling and tickling me. For a few seconds, I could almost pretend we were a normal, happy family again. Annabelle, however, stayed silent. "What?" I whispered, after we had turned on the television to distract Carter. "It's just," my wife hesitated. "You're different." Different? I peeked through the bathroom door at the mirror. My hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under my eyes, but none of that was news to me. Different how? "I don't know," Annabelle shouted so loudly that Carter looked up from his cartoons. She brought a hand to her forehead. "All this is just a lot, okay? I need time." Until that moment, I hadn't had a plan, but what I needed to do was suddenly crystal clear. "I understand. That's why I'm going back to the house tonight." My wife opened her mouth to protest, but I shook my head. "It's better for all of us this way." Carter had turned back to the TV screen, where a frightened white rabbit was running up an endless flight of stairs, pursued by an axe-wielding devil wearing a jester's cap. I had never seen the program before, and while it was probably supposed to be funny, under the circumstances it sent a shiver up my spine. I picked up my overnight bag, gave Annabelle a kiss on the cheek, then left the hotel room. Terror seized me the moment the door closed. What if I had made an unforgivable mistake? I was suddenly sure that if I opened the door again, I would discover that my wife and child had vanished, swallowed by whatever strangeness was pursuing our family. I had to know. I fumbled with the key card, tugging on the door handle desperately while that damned little light flashed red again and again. When I finally crashed inside, I found Annabelle with one arm around Carter's shoulder. She was ready to protect him, but not from any horror movie monster. She was ready to protect him from me. Sorry, I stammered. I just forgot something. The nearest thing at hand was a free disposable coffee cup. I grabbed it and stumbled back out into the hotel like a sleepwalker. Since Annabelle would need the car, I took a taxi home. The rain was coming down harder than ever, but it felt like the driver spent more time checking me out in the rear-view mirror than watching the road. "What?" I demanded, when he finally came to a stop in my driveway. "Nothing." The man looked down at the meter. $42.75, please. I stuffed a 50 into his hand and told him to keep the change. Inside, the house felt far too quiet. The taxi driver was still idling in my driveway, almost like he was waiting for me to change my mind. What had he seen? What had he been staring at so intently in the rear-view mirror? I closed the blinds and tiptoed upstairs. I wished that I'd brought something to protect myself with, even just a kitchen knife or a hammer, but it was too late now. The door to Carter's room stood wide open at the end of the hall. I didn't really expect the mysterious corridor to be there waiting for me, but I was almost disappointed to discover that my son's room was just an ordinary bedroom. 4 white walls, bare hardwood floors, big wide windows. Would it remain that way after nightfall? There was only one way to find out. I started making my preparations right away. Around dinner time, I called to check up on Annabelle and Carter. They were both fine, if a little shaken up. Carter had enjoyed exploring the hotel and splashing in the pool. They had gotten Chinese takeout for dinner. When I told my wife what I was planning, her reply was immediate. "I really wish you wouldn't." "Why not?" I demanded. "What do you think is going to happen?" Carter hooted excitedly in the background. At his age, that couldn't mean anything good. He had probably found an electrical outlet and a fork to stick into it. "I should go," my wife whispered, then hung up. Although I knew she had to take care of Carter, it didn't feel like that was why she got off the phone. It seemed a lot more like she was trying to avoid my question. Sighing, I looked over my setup. A chair hidden behind the door. A cell phone ready to record, facing my son's crib. A baseball bat, a pocket knife, and duct tape you never know, I figured. I had filled the disposable cup I'd gotten from the hotel to the brim with strong coffee, and I sipped it slowly while I watched the sun go down. The past 3 days had been exhausting, but I couldn't use anything that might create light or sound to keep myself awake. I didn't want to do anything that might change the pattern of the past several nights. I must not fall asleep, I repeated to myself. No matter what, I must not fall asleep. When my eyes snapped open, my watch read 4:17 a.m. Over 2 hours had passed since I'd last checked. It was possible that I had missed the whole thing. Without remembering the need for silence, I sprang to my feet and scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. But there was a new, lightless hallway leading into the wall behind me. I turned, barely daring to breathe. I could feel the cool air pouring out of the impossible space, chilling the sweat on my skin. Gripping my baseball bat, I stepped forward into the darkness. I had decided not to use any light source. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, and I could feel my way along the corridor just fine. The rough paint was familiar beneath my fingertips. This could have been the same corridor that led to my bedroom, except that it hadn't been there just a few hours ago. I knew that there was a room at the end of the hallway only because a light suddenly switched on behind its door. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting. There was movement inside. The door swung open. A dark figure stood backlit by a lamp. It ran a hand through its hair, shouted something, and hurried past me toward my son's bedroom. I held my breath as it passed, but there was no need. It was too distracted to notice my presence in the dark. After the figure passed, I slipped into the well-lit room ahead. I needed to know where it had come from, what it was, and what it wanted with my son. The last thing I had expected was to find myself back in my own bedroom. The plaid bathrobe hanging from the bathroom door, the digital alarm clock, the stack of towels on the dresser. Everything was the same. Or was it? The view out the window was unchanged, but it was covered by curtains. They looked identical to the ones that were still boxed up in the garage, because I had never gotten around to hanging them. My Raymond Chandler novel was on the nightstand, but the bookmark was all the way back in the first chapter. What the hell was happening to me? Something in the hallway was coming toward me, muttering. Even though I was armed, I didn't want to risk a confrontation, not until I had a better idea of what was going on. The closet was half open, and I ducked aside, pressing into a wall of familiar yet unfamiliar clothes. Through the cracked open closet door, I could finally get a full view of the thing that had been frightening my son. It was like looking into that mirror. Worse, in a way, because the thing in that bedroom wasn't just my reflection. It was me. Its voice was still distorted, but now I could make out what it was saying. "Carter, where are you, buddy? This isn't funny." The thing that looked like me scratched its head and stroked its 3-day growth of beard, tossing aside pillows, checking under the bed. What would I do when it got to the closet? It left my line of sight. I lifted the bat, my hands slick with sweat. Seconds later it reappeared, a glowing screen in its hand. "Carter, Carter," it yelled, jogging back out of the bedroom. It was doing exactly what I would have done, making one last sweep of the house, then calling the police. If I wanted to get out of whatever this was and back to my own reality, I realized my time was running out. I took a deep breath and slipped back into the hallway. Somewhere in the darkness, maybe on the first floor of this eerily similar house, I could hear my own disembodied voice, shouting for my son. As I walked, those panic cries became warped and distorted. Finally, they faded altogether. I could see my son's bedroom up ahead, his crib on the opposite wall, the purple gecko plushie, and the shattered camera on the floor beside it. I was almost there, but the corridor was longer than I remembered. It stretched out beneath my feet like some kind of nightmarish treadmill. The distance between me and the world I knew might be as short as a few feet, or longer than the distance between stars. There was no way to know. From my left, the beam of a wildly waving flashlight illuminated the ceiling. "Hey, stop right there," someone was shouting. "Hey." It was coming from the first floor, from the bottom of the stairs in the middle of the hallway. In the shaking flashlight glow, my own face stared furiously up at me. Instead of a baseball bat, this version of me was armed with a butcher knife. "What did you do with my son, you bastard?" It snarled, then lunged. I realized that something about its presence had readjusted the weird space I was trapped in. Suddenly, I was making progress again. Carter's room was still dead ahead. I sprinted as hard as I could and felt the air change when I crossed over. I didn't turn around until I was beside Son's empty crib, but even so, I knew what I would find behind me, a bare wall. Somewhere out there, beyond impossible distances of space and time, my pursuer was probably about to burst confusedly into its own version of Carter's room. From his perspective, I was the bad man who had come creeping out of a dark room. In my bedroom at the end of the hallway, I could see my phone on its charging station. I hurried back to it, eager to tell Annabelle what I had discovered, until I remembered that my phone should have been set up to record on a chair in Carter's bedroom. Wherever or whatever this place was, it wasn't the same place I had started from. There was movement downstairs. Keys jangling, turning in a lock. Somebody was about to come through the front door. I grabbed my bat and crept to the top of the stairs. A dark shape stood on the porch, backlit by the outdoor lamp. It put its keys away, sighed, then stepped inside and turned on the lights. "Annabelle," I gasped. After so much darkness, the brightness from the first floor was blinding. My wife glared up at me, her face a mix of concern and anger. "You were supposed to pick me up at the airport 4 hours ago. Is everything all right? Where's Carter?" My mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. How could I explain that Carter was with another Annabelle, in another world where we were strangers? Even if I could have found the right words, I already knew that she wouldn't believe me. I wish I could say that this story had a happy ending. I wish I could say that when I returned to Carter's room, I found a passage back to the world where I had left him instead of 4 bare white walls. But that isn't what happened. Instead, I'm going to be back in this room tonight, waiting, hoping to find a way back to my son. hoping that I won't wake up with my own enraged face staring down at me and a knife at my throat. I'd like this story to serve as a warning. Maybe one day you'll be visiting a distant relative or a new friend, or maybe even unpacking boxes in a new home of your own. You'll turn around and notice a door where you were sure there wasn't one before. You might see a familiar-looking room on the other side. You might see a friend, a loved one, or even yourself. You might be tempted to take a walk down that dark corridor. If you do, just make sure that you're aware of the consequences. I'll never forget the night before my mom passed away. The entire family, mom, dad, grandma, my much younger 8-year-old brother Brian and myself, had all gathered around the dinner table to celebrate the holidays, joking and laughing as we ate grandma's famous cookies before heading to bed for the night. The next morning, mom was gone. Brian took it the hardest. With my dad always at work and me being off at college, my brother naturally turned to the only family member who was home to support him, Grandma. She'd bake him her famous cookies, play games with him in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. And as a result, somehow in the wake of Mom's death, Brian got better and returned to his happy and joyous self, basking in his time with his new, albeit older, parental figure. But just a year later, Grandma had a stroke, leaving her conscious but paralyzed in a wheelchair, unable to speak and barely able to move. Brian was once again inconsolable, sitting by Grandma's side in silence by day and crying himself to sleep at night. Sure, he had been profoundly hurt by the loss of our mother just a year prior, but losing Grandma, or at least the Grandma we knew, was somehow even worse. She was there, but not there at the same time, causing him to cling on to her in a way he simply hadn't with Mom. Seeking to fill the void of Brian's attachment with Grandma, Dad and I tried everything, from hiring a nanny to watch over him while we were away, to me even putting a pause on college for a while to be home with him. But no matter what we did, nothing worked. Day by day, he simply hung his head in sadness, sitting by Grandma's side and refusing to speak as if in solidarity. Until one day I read an article about an AI company specializing in a conversational experience designed to emulate that of a lost family member or lover. The concept was simple. Provide the company with as much information about the loved one as possible, and they create a chatbot custom-tailored to recreate their personality, capable of responding, engaging, and asking questions in the exact tone, style, and personality of said loved one, in our case, Grandma. Sure, it wasn't quite meant for someone like Grandma who hadn't actually passed away, but we were desperate to try anything to get Brian back to normal. So we mailed the company every recipe Grandma had ever come up with, every letter she had ever written, and every story she had ever told us, and waited. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, we received a confirmation email from the company. Congratulations, Grandma's chatbot is ready. Together as a family, Brian, Dad, and myself, along with Grandma in her wheelchair, signed into the chatbot on a tablet, placed it in Grandma's lap, and began talking with her. And sure enough, she came alive again. Hey, Grandma, how old were you when you gave birth to Dad? I asked. 29, the chatbot replied, in an eerily perfect recreation of Grandma's voice. Hey, Grandma, what's your favorite movie? My dad asked, attempting a trick question. I hate movies, the chatbot replied, just as Grandma used to do. We all let out a laugh, including Brian, who, after previously being a bit hesitant, quietly walked up to Grandma and asked his own question. Hey, Grandma, what's the secret to your cookie recipe? Nutmeg and a sprinkle of sea salt, she replied again, just as she always had. It brought a smile to Brian's face, causing Dad and myself to practically shed a tear. Brian continued to ask questions, and in just a week's time, my poor brother, who had been driven into depression after 2 back-to-back losses, had bounced back, once again returning to his happy self. It was as if Grandma was back, her relationship with Brian returning to business as usual, as she taught him how to bake her famous cookie recipe himself, talked to him while he played in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. All through the voice of the chatbot, of course, while Grandma herself sat there in silence, enjoying Brian's return to normalcy, or so we hoped. But I couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical of the situation as we watched Grandma sitting there, an AI voice speaking on her behalf, while she herself, unable to speak, simply looked at us, her eyes moving around in silence. I couldn't help but wonder what she was actually thinking. But despite my hesitation, my dad insisted that everything was okay and, feeling a pressure to return to work and school respectively, my dad and I were left with no choice but to leave Brian home with Grandma at least during the day. And for a while all was well, until months later when it came time for us to go on our yearly family camping trip. Sure, our numbers had dwindled, but with the introduction of Grandma's chatbot we had regained one more family member. So the four of us, Dad, Brian, Grandma and I, set off in our camper and headed upstate for what was to be a week of relaxation, at the same spot by the river we always camped at. It had been a family tradition, going all the way back to my dad's youth, and was complete with a fire pit, treehouse and old cabin. For the first couple days, things were normal, as Grandma's chatbot filled the silence of Grandma's stroke, as she cheered Brian on as he baked her famous cookie recipe by the fire, called up to him while he played in the treehouse, and read him bedtime stories at night in the old cabin. But on the third day, something changed. When Dad and I got back from playing baseball by the river, we found Brian sitting by the fire pit, staring at a charred batch of cookies that were burning in the fire. "What happened here, bud?" my dad casually asked Brian. "Grandma told me to destroy them." "Why?" I asked. "Because she said I didn't cook them right." Dad and I didn't quite know what to make of it, so we simply both let out a nervous laugh. "She always was picky," my dad reasoned jokingly as he walked away. Later that day, while Brian was hanging out in the old treehouse, Grandma sitting there in her wheelchair below, I realized he had gone uncharacteristically quiet and decided to climb up its wooden ladder to investigate. Upon discovering my brother carving words into the walls of the treehouse, I asked, "What's your writing, bud?" But he didn't reply. He simply kept scratching away at its wooden walls with a rock. Again, I didn't quite know what to make of the bizarre behavior, so I simply ignored it. And then later that night, I overheard the weirdest thing yet. As Grandma's chatbot read Brian a bedtime story in the old cabin, I heard her read some of the sentences backwards. "That's odd," I whispered to myself, confused by the creepy-sounding rendition of the story. But the creepiest thing about it was the fact that Grandma herself lay asleep in her wheelchair as her AI voice read on. I thought to interrupt and let Brian know that something might be wrong with the chatbot's software. But he had already fallen asleep and looked so content in his slumbers that I decided to leave it alone and went to bed. The next day, things escalated. In the morning, we found Brian once again sitting by the fire, this time cooking something else, in the fire. "That's no cookie," my dad said to me, his nose twitching, before we both ran over to inspect what my brother was roasting. Lo and behold, there was a burnt squirrel cooking away on a stick, as Brian stared deep into the fire. But before we could say anything, my brother picked up the charred creature and began eating it as though it was a piece of corn on the cob. "Brian, what are you doing?" my dad yelled. My brother simply turned to him and said, "Having breakfast." "Why are you eating that of all things?" I asked in disgust. "Grandma told me to," he said, taking a bite before my dad ripped it out of his hand. "Brian," my dad and I cried out, scolding him in unison. We both looked over at Grandma, who simply stared back at us with wide eyes before we turned our gaze to the tablet that was sitting on her lap. "Hey, Grandma, why'd you tell Brian to eat a squirrel?" I called out to the device. "Because it deserved it," the chatbot replied in Grandma's voice. "Maybe it's time we power off Grandma," my dad suggested as he attempted to reach for the tablet. But Brian hissed at us and snatched the device from Grandma's lap before Dad could grab it, more attached to Grandma than ever. Later that day, as my dad and I discussed whether we should turn off the chatbot for the rest of the trip, we were interrupted by yet another burning smell. This time, that of candles. We looked at each other, confused, before we raced to the source of the smell. The treehouse, where Grandma was once again sitting at its base. Upon climbing up to the treehouse, we found Brian sitting there in silence, his head down, holding a lit candle in each of his hands. The words he had carved into the tree littering its walls like a bizarre wallpaper. "What's wrong, Brian?" my dad asked. "Oh, nothing's wrong," he replied. "I'm just holding a service for Grandpa." But Grandpa already had a service when he passed away years back. "I know, but Grandma wasn't there for it." "Yeah, she was Bud, remember? She was sitting beside you." "Yeah, but Grandma wasn't," he said, pointing down to the tablet in Grandma's lap, where the chatbot remained silent. "Hey, Grandma." Dad called down to the device. "Did you tell Brian to hold this service for Grandpa?" "Yes," the tablet speaker called out in Grandma's voice. "Grandpa's soul is restless and asked for a sacrifice." "A sacrifice?" I asked aloud as my dad and I turned to each other, then back to the treehouse. That's when we saw it. A mangled bird surrounded by more lit candles, its feathers scattered everywhere. My dad and I looked at each other in horror. "Yeah, okay, no more chatbot," my dad said before racing back down the ladder, running over to Grandma, and ripping the tablet from her lap before Brian could even think to stop him. "Dad, stop," he screamed down from the treehouse. "Leave Grandma alone, you're hurting her." But Dad ignored his pleas. "Get rid of that animal, get down here, and be on your best behavior, and I'll consider letting Grandma read you a bedtime story tonight." Brian did just that, returning to normal and spending the rest of the day with us, careful to be on his best behavior. That night, true to his word, Dad wheeled Grandma over to Brian's bed in the old cabin, where the tablet began to read him a bedtime story, before Dad retired to his own bed for the night. Meanwhile, I went for a walk by the river at night, where I would always go to look up at the stars. Until suddenly I heard my dad let out a loud scream in the distance. It was a horrifying sound, the likes of which I'd never heard from him, causing me to immediately run back to the old cabin to investigate. When I got there, I found Brian in Dad's bedroom, standing over a now bleeding Dad, who was mumbling, "Help," before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went unconscious. "Brian," I screamed. Hearing my cry, my brother turned back to me, holding a baseball bat, the same one my dad had been bringing up to the camp since he was a boy. "Brian, what have you done?" I yelled out. "Grandma told me Mommy missed Daddy," he explained before continuing, "so I was helping return Daddy to Mommy." I looked over at the tablet which was sitting on Grandma's lap before it chimed in. "Brian, Mommy misses your brother too. Now that you've returned Daddy to her, it's time you do the same to your brother." "Yes, Grandma," my brainwashed brother replied almost robotically, as if he was somehow connected to the sinister device. I looked at Grandma as her eyes raced back and forth, clearly conscious of what was happening, but unable to move or speak. "Brian, no," I called out as he carried the baseball bat towards me. I took a step back, but before I could run away, I felt a pair of metal jaws clamp down on my leg, crunching the bone and trapping me there. "Arg!" I cried out in pain, as I looked down to discover a small metal animal trap that Brian must have left inside the old cabin for one of us. As I fell to the ground in pain, Brian walked closer, and closer, raising the baseball bat high above his head. Grandma's chatbot spoke again. "Do it, Brian. What are you waiting for?" "Kill him!" Brian took a look at the tablet in Grandma's lap, then back at me, before preparing to strike down on me with the bat as I lay there, helpless. But suddenly, I saw something move behind my brother. It was Grandma herself, having somehow willed herself to stand up as she gripped onto the tablet. "Grandma," I yelled out, shocked to see her standing. That's when Brian turned around, to find Grandma holding the tablet high above her head, just as he had just done with his baseball bat. Knowing what she was about to do, Brian cried out, "No, Grandma, don't do it." But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, Grandma had smashed the tablet to bits on the floor of the old cabin, its glass surface shattering into 1,000 pieces. its electronic innards spilling out everywhere. My brother watched on in horror as he screamed again. No! After Grandma finished destroying the device, having used every ounce of strength left in her body, she fell back into her wheelchair, before saying 4 words. Brian, I love you. My brother's face turned from a look of shock to one of utter happiness, and tears started rolling down his cheeks as he realized his real grandma was back, and snapped out of his trance. He ran over to hug her. Grandma, I'm so sorry. It told me to do bad things. I thought it was you. Grandma tried to reply, but was too exhausted. She simply patted him on the back as he hugged her, crying. Meanwhile, I rushed over to my dad and attempted to mend his wounds before carrying him off to the camper and driving him to the hospital, where he was treated for the next few weeks. Less than a month later, our family had gathered around the dinner table for the holidays, just as we always did. Grandma, having regained the ability to walk with a cane, sat by Brian and I at the table, while Dad, still recovering, sat beside us in the very same wheelchair that once belonged to Grandma. As we all finished eating, Dad turned to my brother and asked, "What's for dessert, Brian?" Brian shot Grandma a smile, who smiled back, and he ran to the kitchen, returning a minute later with a batch of her famous cookies. As we all sat there at the dinner table, eating the cookies, a light snow could be seen through the windows falling outside, and it finally felt as if life had returned to normal. Dad and I were careful not to bring up the incident at the camping trip, lest it trigger something in my brother again, and managed to avoid the topic the entire night until we all grew tired. "I'm sleepy," Brian said as he stared at his phone. "I'm gonna go to bed." With that, he placed his phone on the dinner table, and forgetting it, headed upstairs to retire for the night. "Night, Bud," my dad said with a smile. "Night, Brian," I added with a smile of my own. Dad and I both looked over at Grandma, who, instead of smiling along with us, had a concerned look on her face. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked. She waited a moment for Brian to disappear up the stairs, before pointing to something. Dad and I followed the direction of her finger to Brian's phone, which was still lying there, unlocked on the dinner table, its display still glowing. I carefully reached across the table to pick it up, expecting to find a game or digital comic, but instead found the mobile version of Grandma's chatbot with several characters typed into the login page's password field and an error message that read, "Wrong password. Too many sign-in attempts. Try again in 24 hours." My eyes opened wide in horror as I realized that Brian had been trying to access Grandma's chatbot again. Luckily, we had never given him the password. "What is it?" my dad asked, seeing my adverse reaction. I simply slid the phone over to him, passing it by Grandma, who clearly already knew what was going on. Dad took one look at the phone screen before saying, "We better cancel the account." "I'll do it tomorrow," I assured him, after recalling the correct password, and knowing that the sign-in lock wouldn't expire until then. My dad, Grandma, and I looked at each other, before we all turned to the cookies and started to munch away on them nervously in silence. Our minds all surely wondering if this was actually the end of Brian's allegiance to Grandma's AI chatbot, or only just the beginning. I won't sugarcoat it, I hate Halloween. The cool weather, the creepy decorations, the sound of children giggling as they bounce down the sidewalk. I can't stand it. I know that makes me sound like a Grinch, but hear me out. I have a good reason. As a child, Halloween was my favorite holiday. Yeah, Christmas was great and all, but there was just something different about spooky season that really hit home with me. Well, until I turned 11, that is. That was the year that something truly heinous happened. Something that turned my favorite holiday into the most dreaded day of the year. "Your costume looks great, kiddo. You're supposed to be a Power Ranger, right?" Uncle Ricky asked, taking a sip from his cider. I frowned. "No, I'm Raphael." Uncle Ricky's brows furrowed. from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He stared at me blankly. I could practically see the cogs trying and failing to turn in his head. You know what? Whatever it is, it looks great. Fantastic job, buddy. He ruffled my hair before draining the remainder of his cider. I took a step back, staring at the ground. Guess what my... Ding. The sound of the doorbell cut him off mid-sentence. That's probably Chris. See you later, Uncle Ricky. I raced to the door and flung it open to find Captain America standing before me. Chris's costume was detailed. From the suit to the cape to the shield, he had it all. His parents must have spent a pretty penny on it. Come on, Chris, let's go, I said, ushering him down the driveway. We'd made it about halfway down when Uncle Ricky appeared at the door. You boys be safe now. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you. I shuddered. Something about the way he said that made me uneasy. We will be, I shouted back, still speed-walking away. Hey man, what gives? Why are we walking so fast? Chris demanded once we'd reached the sidewalk. It's Uncle Ricky. I don't like being around him. He's weird. Like, what kind of weird? I shifted my gaze to the plastic pumpkin bucket swinging back and forth in my hand. I don't know, I don't want to talk about it anymore, okay? Fine, let's hit that house first. I heard they give out king-sized chocolate bars. Chris and I trick-or-treated until well past sundown. To my dismay, even though I wore a turtle shell backpack and a red bandana, most people automatically assumed that I was the Hulk. Eventually, I just stopped correcting them. By 9 o'clock, all the other kids had already gone home, and I was getting tired of people thinking that I was Chris's sidekick. This is getting heavy. Are you ready to go back yet? I asked. Come on, just one more house, then we'll... Hey boys, nice costumes you got there. We froze. I didn't know why, but my heart began to thunder in my chest at the sound of the man's voice. We slowly turned to face him. What I saw still sends chills down my spine to this day. A tall figure stood before us. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, and a red-splattered hockey mask shrouded his face from view. Even through the thin plastic, I could hear his ragged breathing. The shallow rise and fall of his chest as he stood there, that predatory stare boring into me. But that's not what frightened me the most. The man was holding a machete, one that was dripping with a dark crimson liquid. Chris and I didn't even say anything to each other. We didn't need to. We took off into a dead sprint, booking it down the sidewalk. I didn't have to look back to know that the man was in hot pursuit. My legs pumped as fast as they could go, and I tried my hardest to focus on getting to safety. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling at the back of my head. The feeling that if I didn't do something, that Halloween would be my last. Help! Help us! I shrieked, praying that someone would come to our rescue. But no one did. The streets were empty, completely devoid of life. If anyone had heard my cries from inside their homes, they could have fooled me. Everyone probably thought it was just some dumb teenager pulling a Halloween prank. Little did they know, Chris and I were running for our lives. After what felt like an eternity, curiosity got the better of me, and I chanced to look back at our pursuer. My stomach instantly twisted into knots. He was gaining on us. Adrenaline took over, and I racked my brain for ideas. My candy bucket, I'd worked all night collecting my bounty, but in that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to make it home in one piece. I hurled the plastic pumpkin behind me with as much strength as I could muster. I watched as it ricocheted off the man's arm and landed on someone's lawn, spilling its contents into their grass. My heart sank. I was out of ideas. This way, Chris yelled, pointing down a side street. My face lit up. We were still out of earshot at that distance, but I could see a woman and a young child walking along the sidewalk further ahead of us. With how far we'd strayed from our houses, she was the only chance we had at escaping from that lunatic. Just when I thought that we might make it out of there alive, the unthinkable happened. I tripped. Time seemed to slow as I went sprawling to the unforgiving concrete. I landed hard, scraping both of my knees in the process. I wailed in agony as tears blurred my vision. I was so dazed from the fall that I had almost completely forgotten about the predicament I was in. until I heard the man's labored breathing hovering directly above me. I suddenly felt someone grab my arm and shove me onto my butt. I have never been more terrified than I was in that moment. The fear was so overwhelming that I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I could barely even breathe. My assailant didn't waste his opportunity. He dropped to his knees and began crawling toward me on all fours like an animal. The machete dragged along the sidewalk, its sharp, crimson-coated blade clinking against the concrete as he advanced. My breath hitched in my throat as the man loomed over me, mere inches from my face. His dark, soulless eyes stared into mine. He leaned in so close that I could smell his breath. Then, to my horror, he brought the machete up to my neck. My mind raced as he lightly slid it across my throat. My entire body trembled when he placed his fingers to the fresh wound and dipped them into the blood seeping from within. I watched, feeling as if the world was crumbling around me as the man reached underneath the hockey mask and plunged his fingers into his mouth. "You taste incredible," he whispered, raising the machete again. My eyes grew wide as dinner plates, but this time for a different reason. In the blink of an eye, the man was lying on the ground with a rivulet of red seeping from his scalp. Chris tossed a brick to the ground beside him and pulled me to my feet. I had never been so happy to see him in my entire life. "Snap out of it, we have to go," Chris shouted, tugging me down the street. I glanced at the man one more time before we took off. That scene is one that will be burned into my brain for as long as I live. Once we made it back to my house, I snapped. I cried uncontrollably for hours, and nothing could get me to calm down. Of course, the cops were called, but the man had vanished by the time they arrived at the scene. I was inconsolable for weeks afterward, and not just because of what happened to me. When I glanced back that one final time, my attacker's mask had slipped, revealing part of his face. The image of my uncle lying there, still gripping the machete, is one that I will never forget. Uncle Ricky disappeared after that night. For reasons I can't explain, I never told my parents that he was the one chasing me. I don't know if they ever made the connection, but I didn't plan on bringing it up. My own memories of the event are painful enough, and I didn't want to relive that trauma. But now I think I've changed my mind. Because yesterday, as I was returning from the pumpkin patch with my wife and daughter, I noticed something lying on a chair on our porch. My blood instantly ran cold when I saw it. A machete, a hockey mask, and a photo were neatly arranged on the cushion. My hands shook as I rummaged through them. When I picked up the picture and held it up to my face, all the awful events from that night came flooding back. The photograph depicted my daughter playing in our front yard, and on the back, written in crimson, was a note that said, "I really hope she tastes as incredible as you did." I live alone in a house that I inherited from my grandmother. It's an old place, a bit run down, but it's been in the family for generations. When I moved in a few months ago, I thought it would just need some updating, a fresh coat of paint and new furniture. I didn't expect anything strange. I have a dog, a border collie named Michelle. She's usually calm, smart, and well-behaved, but lately she's been acting weird. At first, I thought she was just adjusting to the new place. But then it started happening every night. Michelle would sit in the hallway, staring at the attic door, barking like crazy. I brushed it off at first. Dogs bark at all sorts of things, right? Maybe she heard something outside or smelled a stray cat. But her barking, it's different. It's desperate, like she's scared or trying to warn me about something. A few weeks ago, I decided to check the attic myself. I figured there might be squirrels or raccoons nesting up there, making noise at night. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled down the attic ladder, and climbed up. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams creaked under my weight. There were a few old boxes, some furniture covered in sheets, and cobwebs everywhere. Nothing out of the ordinary. I did a quick sweep with the flashlight and didn't find anything unusual. No signs of animals, no noise, nothing. Satisfied that it was just Michelle being paranoid, I climbed back down and closed the attic. But that didn't stop her from barking. Every night, like clockwork, she'd sit there, growling and barking at the attic door. She'd refuse to leave, no matter how much I tried to pull her away. Her eyes would stay fixed on the door, ears flat, body tense. Then, about a week ago, something changed. It was around 2 a.m., and Michelle was at it again, barking like her life depended on it. I was exhausted, so I grabbed her leash and figured I'd take her outside for a walk, hoping it would calm her down. But as I got closer to the attic door, I noticed something strange. There was a faint scratching sound. It was so soft that I almost didn't hear it over Michelle's barking, but it was there. I froze my hand halfway to the leash. The scratching came again, this time a little louder, like something was scraping against the wood. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and took Michelle outside. The fresh air helped me clear my head, but I couldn't shake the sound from my mind. When we got back inside, Michelle was calmer, but she kept glancing at the attic door. That night, I didn't sleep. The scratching became a regular thing, every night around 2 a.m. It would start softly, just a faint scraping noise, but over time it got louder. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded like something trying to get out. 2 nights ago, I decided to record it. I set up my phone in the hallway and hit record, then went back to bed, hoping to catch the sound. When I checked the footage the next morning, my heart dropped. Michelle was sitting in front of the attic door, like usual, barking and growling. But as the scratching started, something else happened. The attic door began to shake, just slightly at first, then more violently. It was subtle, like someone was gently pushing against it from the other side. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Michelle backed away, her barking turning into whines. Her tail was between her legs, and she was staring at the door, trembling. But what really got to me, what made my blood run cold, was the last few seconds of the video. Just as Michelle turned to run, something moved. It was hard to see at first, just a dark shape near the top of the door. But as I kept watching, I saw it more clearly. A hand, pale, too long and wrong, slipped through the crack in the attic door. It wasn't human. It was just there for a moment, reaching out as if testing the air. Then it slid back through the crack and disappeared. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I haven't been able to bring myself to look at the footage again. I don't know what that thing was or what it wants. I don't even know if I'm going to stay in this house much longer. Michelle still won't stop barking at the attic. And tonight, the scratching is louder than ever. Halloween had always been the best night of the year for Peter and me. We were best friends, inseparable since kindergarten. We were the kids who'd plan for weeks, mapping out every house in our neighborhood, plotting how to score the most candy. We'd talk about it at school, where the teachers always gave us their fake smiles and said, "Don't eat too much candy tonight." But Peter and I had one goal, to get as much as we possibly could. We weren't satisfied with the cheap treats. We wanted the good stuff, the full-sized candy bars, the kind you had to beg your parents for at the store. And as we got older, we started to hear rumors. The kids at school said the next town over, Rosewood Heights, was rich. "They give out the big stuff," one kid said, leaning in close like it was a secret. Full-size Snickers, Reese's, even king-sized sometimes. Peter and I had looked at each other then, knowing what we had to do. But there was a problem, our parents. They had warned us, year after year, not to go to Rosewood Heights. "It's dangerous," my mom had said. "Stick to our neighborhood." She never explained why, just shook her head and said, "It's not safe." We didn't believe her. Peter didn't, at least. "They just don't want us to get better candy than the other kids," he'd scoff. I agreed, kind of. I mean, how dangerous could it be? It was just another neighborhood, after all. The only thing different about it was that they had more money. That's all. So that year we decided we'd go to Rosewood Heights. We'd hit every house, and then we'd come back with bags full of candy. It was foolproof. When Halloween finally came, we were buzzing with excitement. I remember the thrill of the night air, crisp and cool, the smell of fallen leaves and faint smoke from people's chimneys. We raced through our own neighborhood, our pillowcases getting heavier with each stop. But no matter how much candy we got, it wasn't enough. Peter kept saying, "It's nothing compared to what we'll get at Rosewood Heights." As the night wore on and the other kids started heading home, we stood at the edge of our town, looking over at Rosewood Heights. From where we stood, we could see the neat rows of houses, each one bigger and fancier than the ones we were used to. The lawns were immaculate, not a single blade of grass out of place. There were even carved pumpkins on every doorstep, perfectly lit. "Let's go," Peter said, his eyes gleaming. "We'll be back before anyone notices." We crossed over, excitement bubbling up in our chests. As we walked down the first street, I couldn't believe how perfect everything looked. The houses were like something out of a magazine. Perfectly painted, with manicured bushes and clean driveways. Every door we knocked on opened to a smiling face, and just like we'd heard, they gave us full-sized candy bars, Snickers, Reese's, Twix. Our pillowcases started to get heavy, but we kept going. House after house, collecting more and more. The people, though, they were a little strange. At first I didn't think much of it. People smile on Halloween, right? But the smiles in Rosewood Heights were different. They were too wide, too forced. The eyes behind them were empty, like they were putting on a mask, and not the fun kind you wear with a costume. Made me uneasy, but Peter just laughed it off. "They're just rich," he said, like that explained everything. I tried to ignore the weirdness. After all, we were getting the best candy haul of our lives. But when we reached the last house on the block, something felt wrong. The house was different from the others. It was huge, with dark windows, and the yard was covered in creepy clown decorations. You know the kind, grinning, exaggerated faces with sharp teeth and wild hair. I hated clowns, but Peter thought they were hilarious. "Come on, one last stop," he said, pulling me toward the door. I hesitated, looking through the window. That's when I saw them, the family. They were sitting at the kitchen table, all four of them. A father, a mother, a teenage girl, and a boy who looked about our age. But they weren't eating, or talking, or even moving. They were just sitting there, staring blankly ahead like mannequins. "Peter, I don't think." "Don't be a chicken," Peter said, and before I could stop him, he rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, loud and unnatural, like the chime had been distorted somehow. The family at the table didn't move at first, but then, one by one, they turned their heads, their eyes locking on us through the window. I froze. There was something wrong with their faces, pale, too pale, with dark circles under their eyes. They looked sick, but their expressions didn't change. Before I could react, they shot out of their chairs. I mean, they didn't get up, they moved like they were being pulled by invisible strings, like puppets. All of them at once, rushing for the door. "Run," I screamed, but Peter didn't move. The door flew open, and they grabbed him, pulling him inside with unnatural strength. Peter barely had time to scream before the door slammed shut. I could hear him shouting, but it was muffled, like the house itself was swallowing his voice. I didn't think. I dropped my pillowcase full of candy and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast closing in. Every house on the block suddenly lit up one by one, like a chain reaction. And then the doors started to open, and the people, the same people who had given us candy just minutes before, were stepping out. Only now they weren't smiling. Their faces were twisted, like the clowns in the yard, with sharp grins and eyes that gleamed in the dark. They were coming for me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, zigzagging between houses, through yards, jumping over fences. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps heavy on the ground. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was almost caught once, a hand brushing against my arm as I sprinted down a driveway. But I slipped through their fingers, my fear driving me forward. Somehow I made it out of Rosewood Heights, my legs shaking, my breath ragged. The streetlights of my own neighborhood were a blur as I ran straight home. I didn't look back, I didn't dare. When I burst through the front door, my mom was waiting for me, her face pale with worry. "Where's Peter?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I just ran to my room and crawled under the covers, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget what I had seen. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter being dragged into that house. I heard his screams echoing in my head. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Peter's parents. They looked worried. His mom asked me if I knew where he was, said he hadn't come home last night. I wanted to tell them everything, but the words wouldn't come. I was too scared. Soon, the police were called. They searched the neighborhood, questioned me and my family. I told them about Rosewood Heights, about the people, the house, the clowns. But no one believed me. They thought I was making it all up, that I was just a scared kid telling ghost stories. The search for Peter went on for weeks, but eventually the case went cold. That was 28 years ago. Peter's face was on the news for a while, plastered on missing posters all over town. But as time passed, people stopped looking, stopped caring, and Rosewood Heights, I could never find it again. It was like it had disappeared, vanished without a trace. Every time I tried to go back, the streets were different. The houses were gone. It was like the town had never existed at all. Now I'm the only one who remembers. Halloween is coming again, and for the first time in 28 years, I know what I have to do. I'm going back to Rosewood Heights. I don't care if it's a ghost town or a nightmare I can't escape. I'm going back to find Peter. Wish me luck. At first I thought it was fun. We lived in an RV, it was like an endless vacation. One week we were in LA, the next we were in Salt Lake City. We didn't know much about our lives before this. We knew we were born in Portland and that we could never stop moving. We always knew we were a special family. I just guess we didn't know how special we were. My parents tried so hard to have kids and almost lost hope. That's why my twin sister and I were so special to them. They're little miracles. It was annoying, but at least we knew we meant something to them. Amelia and I were fairly close as far as siblings go. We were kind of each other's only friends since we were homeschooled. We felt pretty isolated. We never set up camp anywhere fun. No KOA campgrounds with ice cream shops and swimming pools, always driving off-road and living deep in the woods. I guess it was peaceful in a way, but anyone who grew up near the woods understand it's not something you mess with. The first time I really personally realized something was up was just before our 7th birthday, when we were staying in a place in BC called Kamloops. We weren't supposed to sneak out or leave Mom and Dad's sight, but at the time we were mischievous 6-year-olds with a huge, unexplored forest in front of us. What do you expect? We waited until they fell asleep for the night and snuck out of the RV through the window, which was easy, because the window was just a sheet of plastic held together by a zipper, and we set off, with nothing but a shitty lantern to illuminate the path in front of us. It wasn't long before we saw something strange, a glow. Not from our lantern, it was coming from in front of us. It didn't take long for us to see who or what was in front of us. It was a lady holding a small homemade torch, but she didn't look much like a lady. Her hair was matted and fallen out in some places. Her skin was almost blue and looked rotted. Her teeth were yellow and a few were missing, and I thought you could even see part of her jaw. She was wearing a dirty hospital gown. I didn't know where the nearest hospital was, but it had to be pretty damn far, because the last time I remember driving anywhere with a paved road had to be 3 hours before we set up our camp here. Amelia and I were frozen in fear, and for the first time since we had mutually decided affection towards siblings was lame, I reached for her hand. That thing reached out its bony arm to us. It moaned something almost indecipherable, like Mobubu. That was enough to snap me out of it, and I sprinted away, dragging Amelia behind me. By some miracle, we had made it back to the RV, and by some other miracle, got back in without waking our parents. We didn't get much sleep, and were far too shaken up to even say good morning to our parents, let alone tell them what happened. Would they have even believed us if we told them? Well, after what happened next, I guess they would have to. When we opened the door to the RV, we saw that the remains of what we had left out overnight, a campfire reduced to ashes, the sticks covered in charcoal Amelia and I had used to draw on the rocks, and a makeshift table with a few cans of beans, had been utterly destroyed. It wasn't too out of the ordinary to have our camp ravished by animals. We lived in the woods after all, but this was something no animal could do. This looked set up like whatever did it had a plan. What we saw written on the back of the RV confirmed this belief. In the charcoal sticks, someone had written, "You can't run forever on our trailer." Mom made us breakfast while Dad cleaned up the mess. We left shortly after that and drove for hours, not even stopping for quick washroom breaks. Mom and Dad spoke in hushed whispers as Dad drove. I wish I knew what they had been talking about. That night, I guess because Mom and Dad could see we were shaken up, they took us for a rare treat. A dinner at a real restaurant. A shitty diner, but a restaurant nonetheless. It was empty there, which was why my parents liked it, as they hated crowds. I was over the moon. A root beer float and a greasy cheeseburger was anything a 6-year-old boy could dream of. Which was why I was so upset when Mom and Dad made us leave the second someone else came in. It was just an old trucker. I didn't get the big deal. While we were in the RV, Amelia asked why we had to leave while I sulked in my bunk, a glorified shelf. Mom sighed. I suppose you two are almost 7. That's old enough to know. Well, Zachary, Amelia, the reason we had to leave is because we are scared of losing you. Do you remember what happened when you were 4? I had no idea. My memory was never good, but Amelia claimed to remember. We were in Beaverton, not too far from Portland. She said that when we were 4, we were running around in a field when a big man in camouflage and bit boots came up to us and bent down to our level. We're not supposed to talk to strangers, Amelia said. She was always a goody two-shoes. I'm John. Now we're not strangers. What are your names? I'm Zach, and that's my sister Amelia. We're 4, and our birthday is July 26th, 2002. I had apparently said, but I bet Amelia just said I said that to make me look worse. That's when he stopped smiling. He roughly took our hands and started to lead us away. Let's go somewhere fun, Zach and Amelia. I need to take you someplace else. My mom got teary, that's right. If your dad and I hadn't caught you just before you left, we probably would have never seen you again. I took you to someplace safe, and your dad, I shot that son of a bitch in the leg. Hope he had fun crawling back to his house, he said coldly. Amelia and I shot each other glances. Okay, Daddy, I'm going to go to sleep now, she said, climbing over me to get to her bunk. That night we stopped somewhere for the night. I forgot where, probably near the interior of BC or maybe Alberta. I looked out the little plastic window, and I saw her. I saw that fucking lady again. She was staring at me and Amelia in our bunk beds, reaching out for us with that same long, bony hand. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but couldn't, knowing she was there. Life continued on like that for a while. Anywhere we'd stop, she'd be there. Washington, there she was. Nevada? You bet your ass, Montana. Better fucking believe it. Amelia and I didn't really explore much anymore. Partially because we were getting older and gradually showing less interest in that sort of thing, but partially because that experience in Kamloops traumatized us both. That didn't stop the lady from trying to get us. Sometimes we'd catch a glimpse of her on the highway as we drove by. Sometimes she'd appear right where the fire of our campsite stopped illuminating, so we could barely see her. On the rare occasion we went into public to get supplies or food, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of her in the crowd. Whenever she was around, I always heard that damn cry of hers. Mububu. After a while, she stopped scaring me. Well, as much. Everything finally made sense, the day before Amelia and I turned 14. Mom and Dad had left the RV and gave us two a rare couple hours of freedom as they gathered things for our birthday. We weren't parked ridiculously far from civilization, but I'd say a good hour's worth of walking. We weren't that scared. We had lived in the woods long enough to know as long as you didn't bother the forest, it wouldn't bother you. And the lady in the hospital gown was honestly more of an annoyance than anything else. I'd even go so far to say we had almost forgotten about her. I was reading, and Amelia was rummaging around the RV for food. I was getting immersed in my book when Amelia shouted out, "Zach, come check this out!" I rolled my eyes. What could it be? We had lived in this tiny RV for almost 14 years. I knew it like the back of my hand. There was absolutely no nook or cranny I didn't know about. Oh, I guess I was wrong. There, under the driver's seat cushion Amelia had pulled out for some reason, was a box. It was small and a bit squished from all the years of my dad's ass sitting on it, but we could still tell what it was. Amelia excitedly reached to open it. Inside were papers. "Forget about it, Amelia. It's probably just boring documents for work," I said, but the look of confusion to horror on my sister's face was enough to change my mind. They were documents, but not for work. Birth documents. For us. But the stated parents weren't ours. I was apparently Zachary Jr., but nobody in my family was named Zachary. I looked at the father's name Zachary. The mother was someone named Emily. Maybe we were adopted, I suggested. Amelia reached in and pulled out another sheet of paper. She shook her head and held out the next one for me with a shaky hand. Infants missing from Portland Hospital July 27th, 2002. Twins, Zachary Christopher Clark Jr. and Amelia Emily Clark. Ongoing search. Anyone with information is to report it to the police immediately. Clark, Christopher, those weren't our names. Our last name was Brown, and our parents certainly weren't Zachary and Emily. They were Jenny and Kevin. I had a feeling things were going to get worse. I was right, as Amelia pulled out the third and second to last paper. Portland mother of two murdered in hospital. Emily Clark, 27, had recently given birth to twins, now missing, when she was smothered to death in her own hospital bed. Police drawing of suspects. We looked at the police drawing. It was obviously not a complete match, but they were basically the only other two faces we had seen our entire lives. Mom and Dad. CCTV footage shows the two suspects leaving the hospital through a back door with the two infants. Search is ongoing. If spotted, do not approach these individuals. Alert the authorities immediately. We were silent as Amelia shakily grabbed the last piece of paper. This was from 2006. We were 4. After an Oregon man allegedly spotted the missing kids and was attacked by the perpetrators. A glimpse of hope is seen in this 4-year-long cold case. Father and husband of the victims, Zachary Clark, shares this message. "To my babies, I have no idea where you two are, but I will never let go of hope that one day I will see your beautiful faces again. You may not even know who I am, but that doesn't change anything. Until we meet again, Daddy loves you." We couldn't even say anything. What do you even say to that? We just stood in silence for a while. Then we heard a banging on the RV. We jumped and looked outside. It was the lady in the hospital gown, closer than ever. We could see her bluish-gray skin, we could see her hazel eyes. They kind of looked like Amelia's. "More boo-boo," she moaned, reaching out for us again. I looked down to the newspaper clipping. It had a picture of the victim on it. I held it up to the window where she was staring at us. "Moo boo boo," she said again. "Mo boo boo, my baby." All this time she had just wanted her babies. Amelia stepped out of the RV. I was scared at first, but this day couldn't get any crazier, so I followed. "Mama?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "Boo boo," she said, reaching her bony hand out once again, but she didn't run. She let her touch her face as she gently rubbed her hand across her cheek. She did the same to me, but then pointed in the direction of the nearest town. "Goo," she said. "Go, why?" Amelia asked. "Dada," our mother croaked. Dad, Zachary Sear, was he still alive? After all this time? "We have 2 hours until Mom and Dad." Amelia cut herself off. They get back. Let's go. Quick. Although we really didn't have any idea how to get to the town, we somehow knew. Like someone was guiding us. We busted into the sheriff's office, probably looking awful. First came the questioning, then the DNA testing. Then they looked for our parents. Then they arrested my parents. Then the news stories and the interviews. Then we were flown out in a plane, my first plane ever, to Portland. To meet our dad. We were quite the story. They called my parents the wretches of the woods. They thought of them as evil witches who stole us and hid us deep in the woods. I guess they were right, in a way. It was weird seeing them behind bars, serving life sentences, because after all, they raised us for nearly 14 years. But that's where they'll stay. No running, no hiding. There's nowhere to hide in a cell. He burst into tears when he saw us. We didn't. It was weird. He was my dad and all, but was he? I mean, I guess I met him when I was like a few hours old, but I just couldn't connect to him. It took a while, but we slowly got used to our new lives in a house, with a bed and our own rooms, not running from everything or living in the woods. It was peaceful, although most of the time I ended up sneaking into Amelia's room, because after all this time I still couldn't be alone. One time I got a knock on our window. We both woke up and saw the lady in the hospital gown outside, but she looked happier, less rotten, like she was complete again. "Mama," I asked, "could she stay? And I could live with the family I craved." Like she read my mind, she shook her head. "I have to go, my babies," she said, reaching her hand out to us through the window as she slowly disappeared into the night. We never saw her again after that, but we always knew she was watching us. But this time, we wouldn't run. My friend Sam has always been troubled. The sort of kid you knew would go down the wrong path and wind up in the news. I remember when the story about Daniel Petrick came out. He was that teen who, back in 2007, took his father's gun from a safe after his parents took away Halo 3. He came up behind them while they were on the sofa watching TV, told them he had a surprise for them, and shot them both in the back of the head. Not long after the Petrick story came out, I remember Sam laughing and telling me, "Dummy got caught almost immediately." If I were ever going to do something like that, I'd be smarter about it. We lived only 3 houses apart, so we used to hang out a lot. Sam was obsessed with true crime, which meant we watched a ton of it. He was drawn to the most heinous stuff. Like Catherine Knight, the woman who in 2000 butchered her husband and cooked him up into a meal and hung his skin up to dry. The officers who came to her house brushed against the skin, thinking it was a curtain. This was way inappropriate for 12-year-olds, of course, but neither of us had very involved parents. Maybe because of all this stuff, Sam was convinced that evil was pretty much everywhere. "Dude," he said, "if this is how much we see, the people who are caught, how many do you think get away with it?" "Not many," I said confidently. "If they did, we'd hear about it in the news. People would be disappearing. But think how many might be labeled accidents, but are really murders. Falls down the stairs, heart attacks. I bet so many people bump off old folks when they don't want to take care of them or want their money." "Doubt it," I said again. "It would be so easy," said Sam. "I bet there's tons of murders sliding under the radar because people just don't expect you to actually kill. So easy. In hindsight, this conversation screams red flag, but as kids, we both had a morbid fascination with this stuff. But by far Sam's biggest obsession was the piano wire killer, who strangled 4 women in our city and was never caught. I found out from Sam's dad, not from Sam himself, that one of the victims was actually Sam's older half-sister. She was abducted in '99 when Sam was only 4 years old. Like all the victims, she was found naked, her body recovered from the tunnels under Nicollet Island. And finally I understood the motive for his true crime obsession. He wanted to catch the person who'd killed his sister. He was trying to understand how it happened. When I asked him about her, he claimed to remember her singing to him and playing on the swings, and admitted he watched every scrap of news relating to her death that he could. So that summer, I suggested we search. Go into the tunnels and look for clues. Bro, Sam's eyes lit up. That would be dope. We spent a whole summer scoping out those tunnels, winding through unlit utility passages, seemingly forever through the cool dark. If you know your way, you can crawl through a narrow passage to Satan's Cave, where teens and urban explorers sneak in to drink, light up, and graffiti their names. There are even some carvings on the cave walls people have made of goat heads and demon faces. But it's mostly just discarded beer bottles and trash. The explorations were thrilling, but the closest we found to anything suspicious was a switchblade, a discarded baby doll, and a loop of wire that seemed likely to have come from a bracelet. Sam insisted the news was all wrong, that the killer wasn't anything like people suspected. Maybe he was right, but he was wrong about the tunnels. There was no evidence there of any killer whatsoever, piano wire or otherwise. After that summer, our interest shifted from true crime to video games. We played lots of shooters. I got into sports, taekwondo, and later rowing, backpacking, any wilderness stuff. Sam got into drugs. We'd still occasionally meet up for a hike. I'd go for the nature. He'd go for the opportunity to light up and escape his parents' constant squabbles. But I saw less and less of him. By the time I entered college, he was in and out of jail, getting in trouble for dealing, for breaking and entering, petty crime stuff. The last time I heard from him was when he called me from jail, asking me to bail him out, reminding me what good friends we used to be, reminiscing. "Hey Rufus," he said, "remember that summer we spent searching the tunnels?" Yeah, pretty transparent, trying to tug at my heartstrings with a bond that had wilted years ago. But I smiled anyway because those were better times. "That was dope," he said. "We never did find much, did we?" "Nope. Bet if we searched those tunnels now, things would be different." "Hey, maybe we go again once I'm out, yeah?" "Sure. So, I was wondering if you could do me a favor." "Yeah, okay, I was a sucker." I went and bailed him out later that day. We made plans to hang out, maybe to explore those tunnels again. I knew he'd blow me off, but what can I say? He was an old friend and I felt bad that he'd wound up this way, while my life was pretty steady. What's more, he'd found out while in custody that his dad had died. Suicide, apparently, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew Sam's father, but nonetheless surely must have hit Sam hard. Sam was worried now about his mom, having to raise his baby sister alone. Plus they needed money. They always needed money. He wanted to go check up on the two of them, make sure they were doing okay without his dad. I told him I was here if he or his family needed any help. I gave him my condolences. He just smiled and told me thanks, and didn't mention his father again on the drive back. "You know, they actually found new evidence in the case," he said to me when I dropped him off. "Shit, really?" "Yeah, the ghost of a smile. I'll tell you about it next week." But he didn't get a chance. I got a voice call from him 2 days before we were supposed to meet up. The call dropped before I could answer. When I tried calling him back, it rang a few times and stopped. My subsequent calls went straight to voicemail. Sam ghosting me was nothing new, but when our appointed meetup passed and he still wasn't replying to me, I messaged his mom. She said he'd left ranting about the piano wire killer and the tunnels, but she thought it was just his usual talk. He was always spouting big ideas and conspiracy theories, never amounting to anything. She started to complain how she'd thrown her back out, and with him running off again, there was no one to help but Maisie, his little sister. The trash and laundry were too heavy for her to lift by herself. I told her I'd come by later, but now I was truly worried for Sam. Called, messaged, even reported my concerns to police, but they jumped right to assuming he'd skipped town to avoid a court hearing, which was, I admit, a pretty plausible assumption. No trace of him anywhere, still no signal from his phone. He'd gotten out of jail, mentioned new evidence, arranged to meet me, and vanished. I decided to check the tunnels. The entrance we'd used as kids was smaller and more overgrown than I remembered. I climbed down the embankment through brush and dry leaves, out onto the concrete ledge, and then ducked into the cool darkness of the tunnel with its low ceiling and narrow walls. Flicked on my flashlight. The faint odor of sewage wafted to my nostrils as I made my way forward, the only sound the echo of my boots treading on the concrete. After a while of running my hand along the cool brick, I paused and turned to glance behind me. The entrance had become a distant square of white light. Was this really a good idea? Well, obviously not. I might go stumbling into whatever had caused Sam to disappear. Besides which, I couldn't remember the directions to Satan's cave. And even if I did find my way in, what was I supposed to be looking for? You know, they actually found new evidence in the case. Sam's hint in our last conversation had me tugging out my phone, searching the news, and I was stunned at the headline that came up. 25 years after brutal killings, piano wire killer confesses. Whoa, Sam had seriously downplayed this. It wasn't just new evidence. The killer was actually in custody and had confessed. So where the fuck was Sam then? Maybe the police were right about him skipping town, leaving his mother alone to look after his sister, me scrambling to find him, and no one to pick up the pieces from his shattered life. I sighed and headed over to help his mom take out the trash. Sam's car was in the back when I pulled up, and my spirits lifted. I was eager to chew him out for all the usual trouble. When I got inside, his mom told me he wasn't back yet. His car battery had died and he'd left by bike a few days ago. The house was a mess, filled with empty pizza boxes. Several full garbage bags, laundry piled up. Sam's mom, Eleanor, had thrown her back out, I remembered, and couldn't lift heavy things, so without Sam, she had no one to take out the trash or carry loads of laundry besides Maisie. And Maisie wasn't a very consistent helper, being only 11 years old. "Is that Rufus?" Maisie came bounding down as I was collecting the trash bags. Her nose wrinkled. "It smells like ass in here." "You should help your mom more," I said. Once I'd cleared the trash out, I was getting ready to leave when on a sudden impulse, I went upstairs to the room Sam had been using, thinking he might have left me some hint as to where he'd gone. But I found the room taped off with a giant "Keep Out" sign. Maisie, bouncing up the stairs after me, told me no one was allowed in. "Especially me," she added, making a face. "Well, I'm his best friend, so I'm allowed," I said. But the door was locked. Undeterred, I started opening drawers downstairs in the main room. When we were little, Sam would sometimes lock his door and his parents would open it and tell him not to shut them out. I vaguely remembered there being a key kept in a junk drawer. While searching, I called out to Sam's mom, asking if she'd heard anything from him. She shouted back from the basement, "He'll turn up eventually." Like a bad penny, I grunted and opened a desk drawer, no keys, just old electronics and cell phones, and closed it. Then opened it again and blinked. Sam's cell phone. I recognized it from the day I bailed him out. As soon as I had it in my hand, its heavy solidity made my pulse ratchet up. I brought it out to my car and plugged it in. Started up the phone. Couldn't get past the password. After a few more tries, I went back inside. Sam's mom was still doing laundry. I told Maisie to go sit in my car, that I'd take her to get ice cream in a few minutes, and then I went upstairs. My heart was pounding harder now. The unpleasant odor still lingered, despite the garbage having been cleared out. Sweat pooled under my armpits as I peeled the tape off the door and put my shoulder against it. It didn't require much force. A couple of short bursts, and I flung it open. Sam's bed was unmade, laundry on the floor, dirty dishes messy like his life. No sign of him. My eyes turned to the closet, to the faint stain of reddish-brown on the carpet. I slid the door open, wobbly in its tracks. My eyes watered, the stench hit me like sewage and old meat. I closed the door and dialed the police. I bet there's tons of murders sliding under the radar because people just don't expect you to actually kill. So easy. After unlocking Sam's phone, the police discovered he'd been drafting me an email. It included a link to a more detailed article about the piano wire killer's confession. A confession to 3 of the 4 murders, but not to the murder of Sam's sister. Police suspected, even back in 1999, that it was a copycat killing, suspected because the type of wire used to strangle her didn't match with the other victims. Over the years, I'd forgotten this detail. Sam never did. His mom was still downstairs when the police arrived, and I showed them his body, tucked into the closet and curled as if asleep, but rotting. Leaking. Only later would the pieces fall into place, that even as a child he'd suspected his mother of murdering the half-sister who was born from another woman. That the entire summer we explored the tunnels, that's what he was really looking for. Evidence to connect his mother to her death. We found nothing back then, but these past weeks, the piano wire killer's confession brought it all back. A confession Sam's father likely read, but by the time Sam got out of custody, his father was dead. Sam was looking for proof, not only of his sister's murder, but also his father's. He died of blunt force trauma to the head. Unlike his sister's or father's deaths, which were planned carefully enough, even now it was hard to prove them. Police seemed to think his was improvised. Perhaps he confronted his mother, or perhaps she caught him snooping. She likely threw her back out trying to move his body. Sticking him in the closet and sealing the room was a stopgap measure. But even so, she might have gotten away with it, and I might have assumed he was still out in the world somewhere, running into trouble like always, if I hadn't seen his phone. It would be so easy. I never knew when he said this that he was voicing suspicions about his own mother. No wonder his worldview was so bleak, his sense of people one of constant mistrust. He didn't confide in anyone, not even me, but I'm glad the truth is finally out. I just wonder how many deaths, how many assumed accidents, how many heinous misdeeds go flying under the radar like he says. I'm worried that my best friend has always been right, and it's so much more than we realize. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Let me know in the comments what scares you the most. Until next time, and be careful in the dark.